Good morning or good afternoon now. It's straight up 12 noon, and we appreciate everybody who's joined us today. Our speaker is Dr. Shelby Gruss. She's our assistant professor of forage extension at Iowa State. Her roots in agriculture trace back to a small farm in northern Indiana, and that sparked her lifelong interest in agricultural production. She's earned her bachelor's degree from Illinois and completed a PhD at Purdue. Uh, Her research focus is on optimizing forage-based systems through innovative strategies, uh, trying to make forage work better for dairy producers. We're excited to hear from her. I believe this will be the first webinar she's done for us. So, as I always say, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Fred. Thanks for having me today. My title is pretty broad. It's just forage assessment and conditions entering spring. I kind of wanted to keep it broad and open because when Fred asked me to do this presentation, none of the forages were out of the ground yet. We were still waiting for green up to occur. And so I wasn't exactly sure where we were going to be at. And so as we were thinking about going from the previous years that we've had, what are our forages going to look like this year, and kind of getting an assessment of that's going to be really important as we go into the season. And so we're going to be going over a few different things. Basically assessing our forages this year. Our alfalfa stands and cereal grain stands is the focus. And then also, when should we be cutting those stands? And so we're going to get into peak, some other methods such as growing degree days, and how we can use those to determine when we should be cutting our stands for our first cuts. And so one of the big questions is alfalfa winter survival. That comes up a lot with winter hardiness. And so as alfalfa prepares for winter, when we start getting those fall cool nights of less than 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the plant starts to respond. And it responds in a couple different ways. One, the cell membranes of the plant start to adapt and become more fluid. Two, they accumulate a large amount of sugars inside the cell to help lower the freezing temperature. And then they also produce these antifreeze-like compounds to help, both of these are to help the cell from freezing, because if the cell freezes and those ice crystals form, basically it'll puncture the cell walls and it'll kill the cell. Overall, killing a bunch of the cells will end up killing the plant. The cell moves water from inside the cell to outside the cell so that there is a little bit of room for expansion in the cell. And then fall soil moisture can play a large role in this as well. The wetter the soils, the harder it is for the plant to move water out. And so drier soils allows that to happen a lot easier. And then as it goes into winter, the plant becomes more tolerant to cooler temperatures as low as 5 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. We definitely saw some lower temperatures than that this year, but snow cover can act as an insulation. As little as about 2 inches can help stabilize the temperature under the snow cover to higher temperatures so that we're not getting into those lower values. And then ice sheeting. Ice sheeting can be very detrimental to our alfalfa plants, as this can cause a lot of those ice crystals to form, destroying cells. And then as we get into spring, our plants start to wake back up. As we get above 41 degrees Fahrenheit, this causes the alfalfa to break dormancy, and we'll start to see that green up. And we're in that green up phase right now. And we should be thinking about what kind of stand assessments we should be doing. And why stand assessments this year is going to be really valuable is we've had some pretty crazy weather conditions. Most of us are in a very severe drought. We've been in the drought throughout most of the state of Iowa for this is the 200th consecutive week in dry to drought conditions in Iowa. So that is over 3 years of drought conditions. So our soils are becoming very depleted. And we're still in this drought. We're still facing these lower rainfall values. And so if we look at the table on the left here, what we start to see here is this is from October 1st to March 11th of this year. And so 2 days ago. And this is the precipitation departures from our normal. And so we can see that in central Iowa and northeast Iowa, we're still less than our normal values, from anywhere from 2 inches to 3.5 inches. And then in the blue areas, we are starting to see a little bit more rainfall occurring, but I've been talking to some of our climatologists, and there is suspected that we're gonna again be facing a hot, dry spring. And so our stands have been taking a beating for a few years now. And so we need to be able to see to be able to inspect our stands to really understand where we're at. Additionally, our conditions have been very unpredictable. Okay, we've noticed we haven't had rain, but we've had some extremes, up highs and lows. We got lows into the -20s. I think our lowest that I saw in here without wind chill, it was -28 up in that northwest corner. About an average of anywhere between -15 degrees Fahrenheit to -28 degrees Fahrenheit, which was substantially lower than where a lot of times our alfalfa likes to be throughout winter. But thankfully, during that time, right before we got a lot of those lows in January, we had a good snow cover. We got the snow cover first, which kept our plants insulated during that time. But we haven't also just been seeing really uncommon lows. We've also seen some uncommon highs during this time. And this is from January 1st to March 10th. And we've had some very extreme highs. We had 80 degrees all in the southeast and the southwest corners, and 70 degrees during this time. And so what this was causing is we were seeing some early green up. And I even saw some early green up in December. I got a call from a farmer, and he is located in western Iowa in the Castana region. And he was about to graze his dead alfalfa stands, and he's like, well, it's starting to green up. And so you can start to see some alfalfa greening up here in the middle of December. And this is what it looks like on a closer up. And so our plants were starting to use some root reserves during that time. And then we got those cold temperatures again in January. Again, thankfully, we had that snow cover during that January timeframe, and the plants would have gone back dormant. But then we had again another early green up, and this photo was taken in late February. This photo was taken in southern Iowa, and so we were starting to see plants starting to green up, putting on more leaf material. And within 3 days later, I think this freeze was in early March, we got down to 8 degrees Fahrenheit that night. And that freeze lasted for quite a few hours. I think it was about 4 to 5 hours that freeze was there. Temperatures didn't really rise above 10 degrees until about midday. And so we hit really cold temperatures again. And when alfalfa plants hit green up, they're breaking that dormancy, and they become super susceptible to these colder temperatures. And so that antifreeze mechanism that I was talking about earlier that they go through in the fall, a lot of times when they break dormancy, they don't have the time, if we have a cold snap, to put that antifreeze back in to protect the plant. And so with all these green ups, cool downs, warm days, cold nights, this back and forth, it's going to be really important as we go into this year to plan ahead on what's going on. We need to identify what our goals are. And then we need to be able to see what our stands are at. So we need to do some evaluations to be able to figure out where our stands are and how we can transition to meet those goals. And so this chart on the right is just a very generic chart for the United States. And so that's why some of these timeframes are very wide, because it's just a generic chart for the US. But why I have it here is I want people to start thinking about, how can I adapt for this year, dependent on where my stands are at. So if something needs to be rotated out, what can I put in this year? What kind of time frame do I have for that? And so trying to do that, and then also, how much of that forage is needed, how much forage is needed for the year. So do I need something that's going to be producing a lot of tonnage versus quality, or am I going to need something that has more quality versus tonnage? Trying to meet the needs for each producer. Whether you're producing for trying to produce for your lactating animals, or you just need feed for your dry heifers for now, and trying to balance that out. And that's all going to be based on where you are at right now. And so it's going to be very important to do stand assessments to understand what our predicted values for our potential yield is going to be. And we should be doing this on the things that are probably greening up right now, which is our alfalfa is starting to green up again, and our cereal grains. And these stand assessments are going to tell us a lot about what we can do with it this year. And so I like this photo on the right here. This alfalfa is only 10 months old. And it was from a stand that's 10 months old. And it has a root that's about 6 feet. We'll say it's 6 feet long. And so if we're thinking about that, we're going to have another dry year or another hot, dry year coming up, a plant's going to do an established alfalfa stand is going to do a lot better than a seedling. It's going to be able to withstand some of those that drought environment, because it has this root system that's going to have a lot better of a chance reaching water from the soil, from deeper in the soil depths. And so lower the water table, those stands are going to have a better chance hitting that lower water table. And so if we're thinking about our stand assessments and where they're at, what is going to be our best opportunity to maximize yield? And so if we have a stand that's okay, it may be better to take care of that stand and try to get that as max production than maybe rotating it out for this year, because that stand's going to be able to produce better than potentially a lot of smaller seedlings or putting seeds in the ground with no moisture. And so trying to find that balance line. And then we're going to get into a little bit more about like when to cut and predicting that quality for that first cutting to either maximize quality or if we need to be maximizing yield. And so when we're thinking about that winter kill and what our stands are and how they're going to do is we're looking at what stands are more susceptible. So a lot of times our older stands are going to be more susceptible to winter kill. Variety can play a large role. And so that's why I think this is an alfalfa variety ratings for 2024. These can be really helpful because varieties that are ranked for winter hardiness are probably going to do a little better during winter cold periods, but also varieties that are more resistant to root rots, to different diseases, can generally survive winters better because they're going in with a healthier root system. Different soil properties are going to play a large role. Soils with high fertility and high pH are going to be better to withstand some of these winter damages, where if we start getting pHs below 6.6, we're going to start looking at those plants as a little bit more susceptible to winter kill. Soil moisture, we can't control soil moisture very well, but actually having a dry year is very beneficial. As the drier the soils are, the more the ability the plant has to move water outside of its cells. If it's super wet soils, we're concerned about that being able to move that water out. And then also we start getting into concerns with heaving. I'm not really too concerned with heaving this year as we don't have a lot of soil moisture. And then we're going to get into that fall cutting date. Fall cutting date, if we're not giving the plant time to restore those carbohydrates, so giving it at least 6 weeks from our last cutting to the first hard frost, not giving the plant that time to restore those root carbohydrates can make that stand more susceptible. And so as we're going in and we're starting to think about, okay, I do have some stands I need to be looking at. How do I do my stand evaluations? How do I go through and look at my different alfalfa and make a call on whether I need to keep it, rotate it, or interseed? And so stand evaluations can be done very easily and very easily with I have 3 tools here. I would argue you could do it with just the 2. but a square foot quadrat. So this is just a PVC pipe that was made into a square foot. And you can use that, you toss it out in the field, see where it lands, and then you'll take your measurements inside of there. A pocket knife. The pocket knife will be used to split open the roots, or just any type of knife, and a spade to dig up those roots as well, to check root health. I generally honestly dig up my roots with my pocket knife, so I normally don't carry a spade with me when I do this. But it's fairly simple to be able to do this and get a good idea of where your stands are at. And so when we're going into our stand evaluations, there's generally 3 different time frames that I'm thinking about when I'm looking at my stands. And this chart was put together by my predecessor, Steve Barnhart. And what they were able to do is look at it. It's like, okay, at green up versus at 3 inches of growth versus at 6 inches of growth, what we should be looking for and what kind of action we should be taking dependent on where we're at. And I think this is very helpful, because if we're trying to do things that at green up for like counting stems, we might not be able to get a very accurate reading of where we're truly at. And so when the fields are starting to green up, which is kind of where we are now, we're between that green up and that at 3 inches of growth, depending where you're at, we're starting to kind of look at the overall stand. We're looking at, do we see some large dead areas? Do we see any dead areas? Is my field greening up slower than everybody else's in the area? Different things like that can play a role in what we're looking for and looking at. And so if we're seeing these large dead areas in our field, we might need to be rotating out of alfalfa this year. If we just have these large dead areas that aren't producing anything. Some small dead areas, we may be considering reseeding or interseeding into it. And then checking also how this is doing as time progresses. Random injury, and then if there's little to no injury and the plant health appears to be normal, we should be rechecking that again in a few weeks to make sure that we're still on a good path moving forward. And so as we get into that next step, looking at it more at that 3-inch growth, we're looking at those damaged areas. And is that plant health deteriorating even more around there? Is the stand getting worse, or is the stand getting better? Was there some areas that just had some delayed green up? Where does that look? And we can go into whether that stand is adequate. Are we just seeing those areas get larger and we need to rotate out? Or is it adequate, but we're not really sure? Then maybe we should be rechecking again in the future. And so as we're kind of looking at that, it's kind of a whole field look and walking through that field, looking at those areas. And so these are 2 photos from green up this spring. The one on the left, this was taken in late February. As you can see, we're starting to see a little green up. There's still a lot of dry material out there and brown material. And so what I'd be looking for is in the few weeks is that brown material starting to get evenly green. But as we can see, for what is turning green, it's very consistent across the field. The field, I don't see any big bare spots, maybe a few small ones. And you can walk the field and get a better idea of what you're seeing. Where this photo was taken just a couple days ago. And so we're a little bit further along. We're a little further along in this green up process. And we're starting to see some green coming in, but I'm also seeing a lot of dark brown areas where that's probably some soil, some areas that are definitely further behind. And so I would be going through, checking those, seeing what is there, how it's doing. This field specifically is an alfalfa grass mixture, and I did walk through it, and a lot of that dead area that looks like there is grass, but I also was seeing a lot of soil. And so there was a lot of large dead areas that I would be concerned about getting those filled in this year. And so that's what kind of looking for in that green up area. And so when I'd go into those areas that are a little bit further behind, I'm looking for I'm looking for asymmetric green up and that delayed green up again, what's behind, what's ahead, uneven growth, and then also looking at root damage. And so asymmetric green up can look like asymmetric green up within your own field where there's some that is further ahead than others. Or it can even look like on one single plant where half of the plant is growing really well. And this photo here kind of shows this. This half of this split root was greening up and had some buds coming off of it, where the half on the right was not. It was pretty much dead at that point. There was a little bit of green coming off, but it was half of that root was not, or the half of that crown was not greening up while the other half was. And this one was fairly easy to determine because as you can see here, there is half of this crown is definitely very damaged. You can see that brown rotting appearance. And then also, but on the other side, we still have this white, fresh, healthy looking root. And so half of that crown had been damaged during winter, or I suspect in this case, it was an insect that did part of this damage, but we're starting to see that asymmetrical green up. This uneven growth in this photo here, what we're seeing here is it looks like half of the crown, half of the buds off of that crown are taller than the other half in those stems. And so we're seeing is those taller stems are most likely from buds that were put on the plant in the fall. And so generally when we have spring green up, it comes from buds that were produced in the fall. But if those buds got damaged during the winter time, we'll start to see stems that are shorter than other stems because the plant had to go through and recreate buds, and those are spring buds. And so they're delayed. And then we want to look at that root damage. 4 to 6 inches down that root, we want to split it in half and get a good look at how those roots are doing. Some alfalfa plants can take a little bit of damage and they'll be able to still be able to produce well, but generally they'll deteriorate over time. Alfalfa is very susceptible to root rots. And so as you can see here, this is a good side-by-side depiction of a healthy root here on the right. You can see that really nice white coloring. If you were to press on it, it would be very firm. While the one on the left here, we're starting to see some brown discoloration. And as either a disease progresses or damage to that crown, that root gets worse. What we'll start to see is if you press on it, it'll be really soft and it could even be mushy. It'll start to look water soaked. And so that is kind of that's a cue of the progression of the disease. And so sometimes you'll have plants that'll green up and then die back very quickly and won't survive the year. And that's probably due to a root damage, root disease of that type. And so it's really important to be able to go out there because even if you see some leaves sometimes, and you may actually have some damage that you're unaware of. And so after we start getting past that 3 inches of growth, we start getting into that 6-inch growth area. And this is when we can really get into our stand evaluations and kind of start thinking about how much yield are we going to have. And so generally our goal is to have greater than 55 stems per square foot. And so that you throw that quadrant out there, you count how many stems you find in that quadrant, and that will could equal for a normal season's yield. And so that you could get to your 100% general yields for that field. When you start getting below that those 55 stems, and we're looking at 40 to 55 stems per square foot, you're probably going to get some reduction in that season yield up to 30%. And that's going to be dependent on how many stems you're finding. And then when you get below that 40%, or not that 40%, that 40 stem count, we should be considering that if we need to be rotating out of alfalfa, we're going to start really our yields are going to be getting hit. If we need to be interseeding, any other ways we can boost that yield back. And so when we're doing these evaluations, you just take that quadrat over here that you can see, throw it like a frisbee is what I say, just so that you're not placing it anywhere where your biases lie. I know it's hard for me to walk through a field and be like, what is a representative sample of this field? Because we don't want to go to areas that are super thin when most of the field is nice and lush, or we don't want to go to one part of the field that looks great where the other part does not. So we want to try to get a representative sample. So going out there, kind of tossing it and letting it land, and then going and counting the stems in there. And again, our goal for counting the number of stems in that is greater than 55 stems. And so when we are, and so we'll do that again. We want to do this multiple times. We want to get at least 4 or 5 different areas in the field to collect this idea, so we get a whole picture of the field. Because like I mentioned just a second ago, we could have half the field that looks great, half the field that doesn't look great. So we can get an idea of the whole field. And so if you want to actually take it a step further and get an idea of what your potential yield is, University of Wisconsin put together this simple equation. And so what we have is, for our potential yield, which is tons per acre, you can take the number of stems per square foot that you collected, and this would be the average number of stems from those 4 to 5 collections, times 0.1 plus 3.5 to get an idea of where your yield could be at. And if it says, if you get to 5 tons per acre, that is what it could be. It's not saying that's what it will be. There's other factors that are going to play into that. That'll be like fertility, rain, all of that can play a factor when you cut and getting that tons per acre. So this is just to get an idea of what your potential yield could be. And you additionally can do this by doing plant counts. Plant counts, a lot of people like to do plant counts. You don't have to count as high. But with this, generally speaking, stem counts is more accurate. When we are talking about plant counts, it is going to be dependent on the age of your stand. So in your seeding year, we're going to be looking for more plants. We're going to be looking for 20 plants in the fall to see for basically having the best stand we can get. As we get into our second and third production years, we're looking at greater to 5 to 8 plants in that quadrat. And the reason this is generally as alfalfa gets larger and gets more established, more plants kind of fall out, and that one plant can take up a larger area. And over time, as comparatively, when we have a young stand, it takes a lot of them to fill in that area. I personally would rather do stem counts. I've done plant counts before, but it can be difficult sometimes when you have a really thick stand to know, where does this stem come from? Or is this a plant or is this a plant? We got to start looking at, where's that crown, getting into how far does that crown outstretch? And so I think stem counts is a lot more accurate because I can easily just pull stems to the side as I'm counting them. And so all of that's going to tell us is where our field's at. And so after we kind of have an idea of where our fields are, what should we do next? What is our next steps? Do I need to rotate to something else? Should I be considering just tearing that field out? And if I need forage, planting a summer annual or another annual into that field instead? Do I just need to delay the first cut? Delaying the first cut could help restore some carbohydrates to the root. Do I need to interseed? Is interseeding an option for you? Are we able to meet the needs for this year? Or maybe the goal is to extend the stand life for multiple years. And so what we're interseeding could play factors into what our goals are, should play a factor to what we'd be interseeding. And there's a chance there's nothing is necessary. Keeping up our normal fertility treatments, keeping up with our normal cutting schedules could be exactly what your stand needs this year. That's all going to be dependent on what where our stands are. And so if we're thinking about managing winter damage, so we are suspecting that our plants do have winter damage, one way is extending the cutting period to 10 to 25% bloom. And so this will take away some quality, but we're rehydrating those carbohydrate reserves in the root. And so I always like this depiction. It just kind of shows where are our carbohydrate reserves in the dark brown. And so as the plant grows, generally we start losing carbohydrates until we get enough above ground biomass to support above ground growth and replenishing that root growth. And so then we start getting back, we start replenishing that until we get it completely back. And so with multiple green ups, if we're seeing delayed green up in some of our fields, this might be what we need to do to get those carbohydrate reserves back. When we do this, though, we need to be considering also increasing our cutting height. If we are extending that cutting period, we need to be thinking about, generally, the alfalfa is going to start putting on more buds at the base of the plant. And so when we cut it, if we cut it too low, we'll cut off those buds and the plant's going to have to regrow them before regrowing. But if we raise that cutter bar height just like an inch, we can avoid those buds, and then the plant can regrow quickly from the buds that it's already produced. And so those are just some considerations to make. One thing to note is extending that cutting period doesn't need to happen every single cut cycle this year. It just needs to occur at least once out of your 3 cuts that you take. Another option is interseeding. And so for interseeding, generally, we're going to be thinking about some trade-offs. And so we need to be thinking about what your goals are. Are your goals to get more yield? You just need more yield this year. It doesn't matter about quality. Do you need high quality with yield, or do we need persistence? And generally speaking, we can get 2 out of the 3, depending on what we're interseeding. It's hard to get all 3. As we're interseeding back into alfalfa stands, because we cannot interseed with alfalfa itself. And so some options for interseeding include we can interseed with grasses or legumes. When we're doing grasses, generally we're maintaining yield. We're boosting our yields back up, and we're allowing that stand to persist for a longer period of time. We're pushing that out 3 to 5 years instead of just a year or 2. Where when we're interseeding with our legumes, depending on what we're interseeding with, we generally get quality back in yield for the year. So like if we're interseeding with like a bursting clover or a red clover, we're going to maintain that quality because both are fairly high quality and that yield. While if we're interseeding with like a bird's foot trefoil, we're going to be maintaining that quality. It's generally not that high yielding, but it's going to be persistent. It's going to persist in that stand a lot longer. So you're going to be able to extend that stand life. And so that's where I get back to, what is your goals for this field? What are your goals? What do you need? Do you need more dry hay for do you need more hay for dry heifers, or do you need more hay for your lactating animals? So trying to get an idea of what you're doing, because if I need more hay for lactating animals, I'm going to be considering interseeding a red clover. It's going to extend my stand life for a year, maybe 2, and it's going to have that yield and quality for that time frame. Where if I just need for my dry heifers, I'm probably going to be looking at more of a grass to extend that stand life even longer. And so overall, with our stand assessments, just a quick overview before we get into our cereal grain assessments. We're looking at our stem counts per square foot or plant counts per square foot, our root health, because that's going to determine a lot about how that stand's going to be able to persist over time, but also how it's going to do in adverse conditions. What should we do with your stand? So what are those goals again? Should we be interseeding and potentially rotating out, or even doing nothing is an option if your stand is healthy. So really thinking about how to meet your goals based on your stand as it is today. And so next we're going to get into our cereal grain assessment. And so a lot of our cereal grains are coming out of the ground right now. These photos are from Nashua at our Northeast research farms. And so we have some ryegrass, both of them are coming out. This was taken about a week ago. And so these stands look very healthy and they look great, but how do we assess if they did not look that, if they were not, if we were concerned about our yields and tonnage that we're going to be able to receive on these fields? And so generally speaking, it's dependent on what species we're working with for what our goals are. And so our goals generally are like can range quite a bit from about 1 million to 1.3 million plants per acre, or versus our rye, which we're reaching for about 750,000 plants per acre. And so this is what we're looking, and per square foot, how many plants we're looking at. And so generally speaking, though, when I'm talking about a assessment, where there's two methods that are commonly used when we're assessing for our cereal grains. And that's the hula hoop method, at least that's what I call it. Basically, you count the number of plants inside the hula hoop. This is a photo taken in soybeans, but it's the same idea. And it's a lot more effective of a method, especially when you have broadcasted plants, than the next one I'm going to show you. So you take the diameter of the hoop, and then you count the number of plants inside that hoop, and you multiply it by one of these depending on what your hoop diameter is. And that's going to bring out to the number of plants that you have per acre. And so basically if you have a 30-inch hula hoop and you count 30 plants, you take 30 times 8,900, and that's going to give you how many plants per acre you have. Again, don't just do this on one spot in your field. Do this on multiple areas in your field so that you get an average of what your whole field looks like. If you just do it in one spot, you could have got a good spot, or you could get a bad spot, and it's going to disrupt what your actual field's going to do. Another way to assess your cereal grains is you measure a foot of a row. And so basically you take your tape measure, you lay it down, you count how many plants are in that within a foot. And again, you'll repeat this in several locations to be able to get an idea. And then you can come back to this chart here. This was from the University of Minnesota. And depending on your row width, if you say you have 6 inches on your row width and you count 12 plants, you're going to be between about 1 million plants per acre to 1.1 million plants per acre. Again, you repeat this in multiple different locations to get an idea of what your whole stand looks like and not just a specific area. And so when I'm thinking about my cereal grains and where they're at, since this is an annual crop, I'm not as concerned about how well it's going to persist over time. I'm concerned about, do I have enough there to be worried about harvesting for a forage? Is it going to produce me enough forage, or should I be thinking about tearing it out and putting something else in to replace it with? And so again, just a quick overview of those two methods. We have that hula hoop method. You just toss that hula hoop out like a Frisbee, count the plants in it, and then you use that factor to multiply by. And then the measuring a row method, where you measure a row. Based on that, you have you count the number of plants based on your row spacing. You can get an idea from the chart I just showed you on how many plants per acre you have. And so now we're going to go into actually staging for our harvest. And so as we're thinking about going into spring, we're thinking about, when do I cut? When do I maximize my quality for that harvest with our yields. And there's multiple different methods we can do for this. We can do growing degree days, scissor cuts, peak, and maturity staging is an additional option. And so we're going to start off talking about peak. Peak is predictive equations for alfalfa quality. And so what it is basically a way to predict whether it's relative feed value or NDF on where we're at in the field. And so you take a 2 square foot quadrant and you lay it down, you find the most mature stem. So if I'm looking, say this is my most mature stem here, I'm seeing some flowers. So we're in basically a flowering stage. And it's on multiple different stems there. And we do have a bunch of buds, where if this was my most mature stem, would probably be in the early bud. There's a few buds in there. So we are checking on that. And then we measure the stem's height. And when we measure the tallest stem's height, we do this from soil to the top of the plant. So we go all the way down to the soil. Then we repeat this 3 to 5 times. And if you have more than 30 acres, you should be repeating this again to get a better representative sample across your whole field. And so say we are using that really mature one that has flowers. So we're in the flower stage, but it was only 21 inches tall. So we can estimate that it's about 183 relative feed value at that moment. But then we should subtract 15 to 25 off of that so that we can take in for harvest losses. And that'll give you an estimate of where we're at for that relative feed value. This can also be used to estimate NDF as well. The first chart was from Iowa State. This chart is from the University of Wisconsin. And so we can be looking for what stages are we going. Okay, so maybe my plant is at 37 NDF. And we are hoping for it to be at closer to 40. So we're basically in late vegetative stage and it's at 29 inches tall. So we can expect that it's going to be a few more days before we get to that flower stage. So we can predict when we're getting to those stages. A general rule of thumb for RFV is RFV value drops about 3 to 5 points per day. So that can help you maximize when you need to be in the field. And then you can also plan, okay, I have a rain event when I'm supposed to be at my perfect RFV value when I want to cut. Say that's 160. I want to cut at 160 exactly. And I have a rain event that's going to occur predicted on that day. Then you can either move it forward a couple of days and go for more quality, or you can say, okay, it's only one rain event. We'll take a little bit of a hit on that and hay afterwards. So you can kind of get an idea of where you'll be at with your field. Another method is the growing degree day method. This one, growing degree days, it's very similar to the idea in corn. We use growing degree days in corn a lot to figure out when it's going to tassel and when it's going to go into reproductive growth or in harvest. And so we have the same equation. It's basically that daily max temperature minus the daily minimum temperature divided by 2, subtracting our base temperature, which in alfalfa is 41 degrees. And that's going to give you the number of growing degree days per that day. And then you add those up for every day until we get to, we add those up until you get to today. And that's how many growing degree days have accumulated. Growing degree days is a very accurate way to predict NDF. It's about plus or minus 3% on accuracy for the first cut, and it's only used for the first cut. It is suggested to be cutting at about 750 growing degree days with that base temperature of 41 for 40% NDF. For upright silos, it's actually estimated at about 680 days just for harvest loss purposes, so that we can hit that 40% after our harvest losses. And our last method that I'm going to be talking about is our scissors methods. And this is considered the gold standard because it actually directly measures our NDF. But this can have problems because once we cut the plant, so we just go in with scissors, cut a sample. That plant continues to respire, so we're actually losing some of those water-soluble carbohydrates, and that fresh alfalfa is very unstable after we cut it. And so then we have to ship it in right away to a laboratory, and it has to be wet chemistry has to be used on this. And so we can't just run it through an NIR quickly, because NIRs are not accurate on wet forage. And so it has to be wet chemistry. And so it can get very expensive and time consuming. And we need multiple samples again to make sure that we're getting a representative area of the field. And so it can be very time consuming because when I send it in, maybe I don't get my results for a week. What if my perfect cutting time was within that week? So it can be really hard to be able to get it in and get it back in time to know when you should be cutting. And then also it can get very expensive very quickly. Although if we have an alfalfa grass mixture, our GDDs and peak are not good for estimates for these mixtures. They're not going to be a good estimate because we are handling two different species. Scissors cuts are the best option for alfalfa grass mixtures. And so, like I said, clip an area and you submit it for forage quality, and you should do multiple areas to get a representative idea of the field. When we are working with alfalfa grass mixtures, we should be thinking about cutting them first over cutting our alfalfa first. Because generally speaking, a lot of our grass varieties, they're going to mature earlier than our alfalfa is. And so if we have an alfalfa stand that's 50% grass and we're waiting for that alfalfa to mature more, our grass quality is going to decline. And so when we start getting in those cutting schedules, the more grass that's in that mixture, that is the one I'd be cutting first and then moving through until we get to that alfalfa that's ready at this time, that pure stand, to get that nice clean cut. But that's general patterns that we should be thinking about. And so overall, predicting our first cut timing can be done very accurately with peak and GDDs. And so these are both our more accurate methods. Peak is okay at predicting the second cutting, but neither are good for predicting our third cutting. And so we should really be thinking about these more as a first cutting tool. Scissors cutting is considered the gold standard, but it's time consuming. It can be hard to get a true representative sample out of those. And then what I didn't talk about is just cutting based on maturity. And this is hard to estimate across the field, especially when we're looking at a lot of insect damage in the fields that can really hinder where we're at. And then additionally, we're not taking into account that height and that the peak is considering. And so we're getting a little bit more accurate method when we take those a little bit further into those peak or GDD growing degree days. And so real quickly, I'm just going to kind of go over looking at our cereal grain harvest. Most of you probably know that we need to be harvesting this between our boot to early dough stages. This is harvested for forage we're speaking of specifically. And so this is because as the plant matures, generally we get more yield, but we really decline in quality very quickly. I don't know how many times I've heard my rye just got out of hand, and next thing you know, I was cutting straw. And so we got to be very aware as we're entering into these stages that as we start to see that flag leaf come up, and that's the last visible leaf on the plant that's going to emerge, that we're going to be starting to enter a boot stage very soon. And so we should be preparing to start thinking about when we're going to harvest. And so we got boot all the way to that early dough stage. This plant here is directly in between that. It's in the flowering stage. So we've already passed boot. The inflorescence has emerged, but we haven't gotten to actual seed development in that dough stage of the seed yet. And so when we're looking at that and we're looking at comparing our yields based on if we're cutting at the boot stage or we're cutting at early dough, we start to see that boot does have less yield in comparison to our early dough stage, but we're having a higher crude protein and higher digestibility when we're cutting a little earlier than when we're getting to that early dough stage. And so this is just based on what are your goals? What do you need? Do you need more of that yield and you're okay to take a hit on some of that crude protein and digestibility, and where that balance is? I like this photo here. It's of sorghum, which is a grain. but I think it depicts really well. So we see that boot stage right here. That flag leaf is completely emerged, and you can start to see that sheath, and it's a little bit more thicker and rounded. That panicle sitting right inside there, ready to emerge in the next few days. While this one is a couple days ahead of it, and it's starting to flower. And so it's just a representation of different stages that could be cut at. And so overall, I just want people to be thinking, what should I be considering for this spring? Where are my field conditions at? Because that's going to really play a big role in what you're going to have this year, what kind of forage availability you're going to have, what things do you need to change to meet your goals potentially? And so what your goals are, what should we be doing to meet those goals? And then what is my schedule? What do I need to be planning ahead for? What kind of time frame are we looking at? And so these are just all thoughts that I want people to be thinking about as we're going into our spring and in our summer months. And with that, are there any questions?
Thank you very much, Dr. Gruss. We've got a fairly small crowd, so you're more than welcome to unmute and we'll just take questions directly. We do have one that came in the chat box asking if you have a thumbnail for what the populations of triticale should be.
My estimation for that would be between our rye and our wheat. So probably around 800,000, but I can look into that and get that back to you. Because if I remember correctly, our rye was at about 750,000, where our wheat was closer to 1 million.
Shelby, a question I tend to get is just, you take a look at different areas of state, different crops are going to work a little bit better, but any resources like for the comparison of corn silage versus like a sorghum Sudan grass silage versus some of these more cocktail mixes that people are doing like with Sudan grass and some clovers and things like that. Any resources in that area?
Yeah, so that will vary really greatly depending on what variety you're growing. A lot of times our corn silage are a little bit more narrow. They've been bred a lot longer than some of our other forages. So there's less variation among our corn silages. Where some sorghum Sudan grasses to sorghums, they don't even look like the same crop. And so there have been a few summer annual trials done in Nashua the last few years that there's some data on that. Unfortunately, with those trials, when they were cut, they were all cut at the same time. So nobody staged differently based on harvest. There are some sorghum Sudan grass varieties that are coming out and forage sorghums that have really high potential in quality reasons, such as the male sterile lines. Some of the BMRs are getting up there as well. It's a hard question just because I've seen data that range just based on location. Currently, I don't have a good just repository you can go into. These cocktail mixtures, cover crop mixtures, and things like that. I have not seen consistent data on it. There's some people that have worked very, very well for it, and I've seen other people that it just fails miserably. And so I am not sold on the cocktail mixtures yet. I do think they have a lot of great benefits in theory, by diversifying your operation, soil health principles. But I've seen them fail as many times as I've seen them be very successful.
And it seems as soils get drier, maybe even soils get a little poorer in quality down the state. I mean, it just seems like they're probably more competitive in those kind of soil structures, or a little more dry.
Yeah, especially some of the summer cocktail mixers where they are developed into some of these more drought tolerant species. Definitely can be very beneficial, and then helping with that, helping develop better soil structures with multiple species in there could be very helpful. But yeah, it could be regionally based and environmentally based as well. Why some work great and some fail. So I think there needs to be more research done on those.
I've got a couple questions here.
Mhm.
When you are counting plants in your frame, do you deduct anything for weed species that are in there?
No, we do not. But if you're seeing a bunch of weeds, I would be a little bit more concerned. Generally a good stand of say alfalfa or rye is going to be able to outcompete a lot of weeds. Rye, especially with the allelopathy, it's going to be able to help maintain a lot of different weed species. But no, you don't. This is just a general rule of thumb for general calculations of how my alfalfa stand is. And I think you would start seeing more weeds as your fields are declining.
Okay. I always get a question about frost cuttings in alfalfa after the plants, been hit with
Yeah.
frost. How will that damage the plant in spring? Is this something we need to watch for the next year?
So generally speaking, that shouldn't hinder your alfalfa at all. The plant has basically, I'm not gonna say, I've given up on those stems. Those stems nothing's gonna regrow from those stems. It's gonna be regrown from new buds. And so those stems will just basically be there next year if we leave them. You can actually, so everybody always says that 6 week window we need to not cut. If you cut like within 200 days, or not 200 days, 200 growing degree days of that hard frost, that actually shouldn't hinder your next year's stand either, because it's not enough time for that plant to regrow any of those buds using those root reserves. So you can cut really close to the frost, or you got to go 6 weeks out. And so cutting after the frost shouldn't have an impact on your next year's stand.
Any other questions? Not seeing anybody unmute. I'd like to thank Dr. Gruss for the presentation. A lot of really good information. Folks, we invite you to be part of next month's webinar in April. Thank you much.